Hey everybody, welcome. Hi Erik, nice seeing you. Um, so
Hello.
I'd like to start with the quote on your homepage, moneyindstate.com, which I highly recommend, by the way. Give me control of nation's money, and I don't care who makes its laws. Uh, Talk about that, and talk about how does that relate to Bitcoin, or how Bitcoin relates to that.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just jump right into that one. Yeah, the quote is, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." And this was said by one of the Rothschilds, who are the famous banking family. And basically, the idea is that the laws of a country are not nearly as important as control or influence of the flow of money or capital. And this was obviously a very telling thing for someone in the banking industry to say, and it certainly is very true. I think in general, the banks can do whatever they wish so long as they maintain control over the realm of money, and the rest of the law doesn't really matter to them because money is so crucial to everything. So it's a great quote when it comes to Bitcoin because the inverse is kind of true as well. If no one has control of the money, then no one need care about the laws as much either. So it's sort of a motto that I like to live by, and essentially, if you are an individual and now you control your own money through Bitcoin, you become sort of the law unto yourself. And I think this is a very important concept when it comes to how Bitcoin works and how it empowers people.
So if we're talking about the current framework we have, we're not in Bitcoin yet. When you're saying that this is very telling that someone from banking said it, how does it work that both banking and the state profit from this scheme? Why are their why are they aligned in maintaining the system that we have right now?
Yeah. Well, the system would probably be called the fiat money system and the fractional reserve banking system. And these two concepts are important to understand individually, but together they give the banking industry and the government massive power. Um, Basically, the fiat means money that has value by decree. Essentially, that's what we use: U.S. dollars or euros or yen. That's all fiat money. And fiat is important because if you're the group that gets to create and control money, you can create it out of thin air and spend it. Um, Everyone understands why counterfeiting is illegal, and yet we have one institution that is given a license to counterfeit whenever they wish. And why that's permissible, I'm not sure, but somehow people got tricked into allowing one group to do that. So that's fiat, and then the fractional reserve system is how banks have operated for a long time. Essentially, when they get deposits, they can loan out a multiple of the deposit to other people. So if there's $10,000 in deposit, they can loan that out to someone else, and now they make money on the money that they can loan out. But they also create money. This is where the fractional reserve comes from. They create money by loaning out more than they actually have. Um, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Of course, in a free banking economy, that still could happen. The problem is that it's risky, and the risk is borne by the taxpayer when it's a government-based money system. Because if banks lend out and they extend themselves too far, and that risk collapses in on itself, all the banks in the U.S., of course, are FDIC insured, which means it's just a fancy word for the taxpayers will come and bail you out if the bank fails. So banks, which are private companies, get this amazing benefit, this amazing privilege, this license, sort of literally to print money through both the fiat system and the fractional reserve model that they operate upon.
So having said that, you're probably not very much surprised about banking or banks not being particularly friendly to Bitcoin.
Yeah, every industry that sees a disruptor coming is not going to be super friendly to that industry. The publishing industry went through this with the internet. Um, Banks, of course, have generally felt completely insulated from competition for hundreds of years. And finally, now there is a technology that actually challenges them. I don't think they quite realize it. I don't think they realize the extent of the danger to them. They don't realize that this is actually an existential threat to their business model. They're paying attention to Bitcoin a little bit, but they don't really, they still kind of laugh at it, I think. And when they realize that it's gotten big enough, there's going to come a moment where they become extremely hostile. So far they're not that hostile. It's more like they don't want to open accounts for Bitcoin companies. That's mostly a regulatory issue because they feel like there's too much risk if they open Bitcoin accounts for companies. So it's not that they're opposed to Bitcoin yet, but I think they will be once it grows to a certain size, and that's going to be a very interesting battle because they have all the money in the world and they have all sorts of friends in government that they can lobby very easily.
Yeah, they have all the money and they can print more. But yes, I agree with you that they have not been on full-on attack yet, which I was a little bit surprised on one hand. But yes, the most problems are coming from Bitcoin companies not being able to open bank accounts. But as you said, that's mainly regulatory issue. That's something that we need to thank the state and the regulatory framework for, not really the banks. The banks are just scared for a good reason. Bitcoin business is still peanuts compared to the risk that it exposes them to. One quote that you can hear a lot, especially from people from banking, is blockchain is awesome, but Bitcoin is worthless. Is there a response to that you have?
Yeah, so the difference, of course, with blockchain and Bitcoin is the currency unit, and the blockchain is this distributed ledger technology. Um, I think that a lot of people have a really hard time um, admitting that the marketplace could come up with a money that might be better. The fact that government controls our money and creates it and is its manager is so strongly ingrained in our culture um, that it sort of becomes a very uncomfortable proposition to suggest that that's not real money. And all the money we have has ridiculous symbolic propaganda on it, continually pointing us toward the government as the creator and wise steward of our money. Um, so, a lot of normal people have that skepticism toward Bitcoin, but institutions do as well. And some of them will admit that the blockchain might be an interesting technological achievement, and certainly it's much more than interesting. But they're still not willing to admit that going alongside that, it's not only that we have a more advanced ledger system than the banks, it's that we actually have a better currency than the governments. And that's a much more frightening proposition because that changes things on a much more fundamental level. And to their credit, I mean, they can point to it right now and say, look how volatile that currency is. It's not a real currency. Any real currency can't be so volatile. But they don't understand that that's a temporary affliction. They don't understand that that's due to the size of the Bitcoin market. It's very small, it's very new, and people don't know if it's going to crash completely or take over the world. But every day that passes, it becomes more trustworthy, and as the market grows, it will necessarily become more stable. And there will certainly become a point where it reaches, where its volatility is reduced to such an extent that it actually does compete for trust with national currencies. And that will be very interesting to watch.
I agree. The stability comes with liquidity. And by the way, if someone has been watching USD Euro in the last 48 hours, it was getting to the Bitcoin ballpark. Like we were talking, singles of percent volatility within a day back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite nuts. And those are currencies of, with multi-trillion-dollar money supply and massive liquidity. So if you can have that kind of volatility in in such currencies, I think it's very telling that we are up for a big change, big shift. I touched over the regulations, regulatory framework. You have been a staunch opposer to the bit license. Can you tell us what is the current state of the bit license after the rounds of the feedback and the new update? I would like to quote from your article a couple of things, and just let us know if that is still valid or if you still consider it a problem. For example, this is quite staggering. This new regulation makes private e-wallets illegal. Read that sentence again. This new regulation makes private e-wallets illegal. Is that still the case? How do you see it right now?
Yeah, so the bit license is I don't know if it's the unofficial or the official name, but it's the name for the body of legislation that's moving through New York State and how they plan to regulate Bitcoin. Why they feel like they need to regulate it when there's already a federal government that has various money laws, I don't know. I guess they just like having more work to do because then they get larger budgets and have more jobs to fill. But in general, they want to completely eliminate many of the great features of Bitcoin, namely its privacy. And people often who work in government believe that they are doing the right thing and that they are good people and that they deserve to have authority and oversight and management and control and essentially sovereignty over individual people's affairs. And this is, of course, antithetical to what America is supposed to be about. American citizens are supposed to be free individuals, and if they are not even accused or convicted of a crime, in general they should be left alone. I think that's a reasonable principle. I don't know if that makes me an extremist or not, but when it comes to money, for some reason, politicians seem to think that it's okay for them to, without accusing someone of a crime, without convicting them of a crime, to peer into their activities and to force them to reveal what they're doing to the government. And this is very Orwellian, but while people read 1984 and most people seem to have a severe distaste for the world that paints, we're already living in a world that's moving in that direction, but I guess it moves slowly enough that people don't notice. So yeah, the bit license, it's gone through a few revisions. There have been a few things that have been improved on the edges, but of course that's how these things are designed. They come out with a certain wording that is really extreme. People get upset about it, and then they tailor it back just a little bit. Everyone gets happy and complacent, and then they push it through, and the whole thing is a negative from the start. So it absolutely should not even exist, but I'm sure it will, and I imagine a lot of Bitcoin companies are going to block New York users after it does. Indeed, there is a moral issue here. If you believe that you do not have the right to spy on people who aren't even accused of a crime, then you are faced with either blocking New York or breaking the New York law. And that's the situation that we face here in America.
And it's not just that, because what happens is that if you force these companies, and especially low-budget startups, to collect all these information, you are exposing their customers to the risk of hack. It's not only that the government can ask for that information, but that information will be accessible to someone it should not be accessible to, just because startups simply can afford a proper security, and there's other stuff they need to focus on.
It's a great point. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we see these hacks of like Target and these other large retailers where millions of people get their personal identities stolen from them. And that happens because credit cards work in a way where the store needs to know all the information about you in order to prevent fraud on the credit card. And it's a terribly vulnerable system, and it's many billion-dollar problem each year, this identity theft that comes from it. And now we have this amazing technology called Bitcoin where you can actually pay for things without revealing your personal information. We have this now. This can save people from this problem. And the government comes in and says, hey, wait a second. Even though you don't need to store all that data in a central database where it can be hacked, we still want you to do that because we want to see it. So you have this technology that fixes the problem, and the government comes in and through law, through what they write on paper, recreates the entire problem all over again. And so now companies that comply with these New York regulations have to store all the same kind of data that Target did when it was hacked. And unless the government can guarantee that it can reduce the number of hackings in the world, which of course it cannot, it is putting people in danger. And this is a ridiculous irony because much of the justification for these laws is, quote unquote, consumer protection. Well, privacy is consumer protection. If you can do your shopping without revealing all this personal private information, you are protected by the technology. And so for the government to come in and undo all that is horribly immoral, and people should really not put up with it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is intention on their side, or if it is just complete lack of imagination, and they simply take 50 years old regulations and they try to apply them to something this new and this fundamentally different just because they're lazy. I don't know, but
it's an issue of priority.
Yeah, what I find fascinating is
it's an issue of priority. So they
go ahead, Erik.
Okay. The priority is they say that they care about consumer protection, but what they really care about is control. They want to be able to control things, and in their opinion, they are good people, and so they deserve to control things. But of course, when the two goals are at odds, when their ability to control conflicts with consumer protection, you can really tell their true colors by the priority that they choose to follow. In this case, they force everyone to put all their data in a central database that is vulnerable to hacking. They do that because their priority is not consumer protection, it is control. And so don't listen to their words and their rhetoric, look at their actions and look at the kind of things that they enforce.
Yeah, I agree. What do you, is there anything you want to say about the industry's response to this?
Well, when you say the industry, a lot of individuals have come out vehemently against these laws, these proposals. A lot of companies stay silent mostly because they're afraid of, getting harmed by the government if they make a statement saying that it's bad. I've been pleased with a few of the business leaders that have been sort of clearly opposed to it. Of course, they make sure to be very diplomatic, and they use soft language, and they're sure to give the politicians all their due respect, and so they're very polite and all that. But they have come out and kind of said a lot of this stuff in the bit license is wrong, essentially. So that's good. It hasn't been totally radio silent from the companies. But in general, people they're nervous to speak out against these things, because if the community is generally quiet in terms of the businesses, and you're the one business that comes out and says, we vehemently oppose this, what you guys are doing is wrong and immoral, who do you think is going to be the target of the first investigation for violations of the rule? So it's it's a terrible problem, and if you're running a company, it's not only your company, you have obligation to your shareholders and owners. So even if you morally feel like you should say something, you're put in this terrible quandary of, you don't want to risk people's money who put their trust in you. And so on we go down the road to tyranny.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that you are bringing this up. One last thing from the article that I found very telling and fascinating was this is not quote from you directly, but you quoted the paper, and that's saying examinations of licenses will be conducted whenever the superintendent deems necessary. I mean, I find it fascinating. That is really like a quote from 1984.
Yeah, I know it's like a joke, except that it's real.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to one more thing before we talk about shapeshift. Ponzi scheme. You had a great response to Gary North, who is someone that we can respect. I'm pretty sure because of his knowledge and his level of argumentation. But he came out with this typical accusation of Bitcoin being a Ponzi scheme. We're hearing this a lot, either in person or online. Um, please talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So people understandably are wary of an asset or an investment that gains 10,000% in a year. Generally, that never happens in the normal financial world, and so when it does happen, it usually is due to some scheme or fraud or Ponzi situation going on. So it's understandable for a casual observer to look at Bitcoin and see its meteoric rise over the last few years, and just say, okay, something's wrong here. Financial assets are not supposed to move like that. Must be a scam of some kind. That's understandable, but if you actually look into the technology and how it works, you should, within a couple hours, be able to realize why it's not a Ponzi scheme. And yet there are people who are, quote unquote, professionals in the financial and investment world, like this Gary North guy. And he persists in this claim that Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme. And his main argument is that it's volatile, and because it's volatile, it can't be a currency, and because it can't be a currency, the whole thing is based on false presumptions, and it will all fail, and everyone who buys Bitcoin is just doing it to sell it to the next fool. And so he just has this horribly pessimistic view on it. And I had to respond to him, not because I think he would change his mind, but because hopefully people that read it will realize why Bitcoin is not a Ponzi scheme. And the reason simply is because there's an actual valuable service that it provides. Ponzi schemes are tricks where you're promised a certain function or service or profitable business, and there's no actual business behind it. There's no value created for anyone. There's no utility. And so it's just a mirage. Bitcoin has absolute utility, and you just have to use it to figure it out. Like you can send money to your friend instantly for free. That's utility. It doesn't mean it has to be the perfect solution in all cases, but it certainly for many uses works really well. So there is real utility. That alone means that it is not a scam. It actually does something useful. Now you can argue how useful it is. Maybe it's just a little useful, or maybe it's going to change the world, and that would, depending on where you sit on that spectrum, is how you would justify a price of $1 or $1 million per coin. But to say it's a scam is just highly ignorant. It means you do not actually understand what scams are, or perhaps if I'm being pessimistic, you're just using that word as a headline attention grabber to get readers.
Yeah, I agree. And there's one more thing that Mises could tell us about this in his regression theorem. It's not just about utility. Utility is where it starts, but when it comes to media of exchange, the value then kicks in and is picking up by the exchange itself, by the expectations of the exchangeability for goods and services in the future. The utility just gives it that first kick before it becomes the media of exchange, and that's where we were 5 years ago, and we've moved from that. We now it's a media of exchange. It's an investment. It has all other functionalities than the initial technology and the utility.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's pick up Shapeshift. You had a great announcement last week. Shapeshift is your new startup. You already had some other startups before. or you ran some other startups before. Talk about this latest one. It sounds revolutionary, definitely, and interesting. Talk about what does it do, what's your aim, and what and the race, and maybe your relationship with Roger and with Barry.
Okay. Yeah. So Shapeshift is now my full-time work. It's been my project for the last year. It launched back in early August, late July of last year. And when it launched, I had not made it known that it was my project. And part of the reason for that was that it is, well, I'll start with this. It is a digital currency exchange, so it's a way to convert between digital assets, so Bitcoin to Litecoin or Darkcoin, any of those. And it came about because I thought it was too hard. It took too long. There's too much friction to buy digital coins. And the fact that we have this digital currency now means that it should move instantly anywhere with no delay and no problem. This is the promise and the economic benefit of the whole system. So the fact that it took an hour or two to deposit money at a normal exchange, make an account, put in a bid order, wait for it to fill, withdraw it, all that, that will easily take an hour. And there's no reason that it needs to. So Shapeshift lets people convert between coins in seconds often, or at most a minute or two. So it's a vast improvement in speed, but it's also a vast improvement in security, because since there are no user accounts, Shapeshift doesn't hold any user funds ever. So when you send a coin in to be converted, it's instantly converted into the other coin and sent back to you. So Shapeshift doesn't have all this holding of money of customers, and so I felt like that was a very cool way to do it, and a much more secure model. And we see when these exchanges get hacked and all these customers lose money, that's happened really too many times. And so anytime that we can build in security or safety by design, just by the design of how it works, I think that's an improvement. So yeah, it launched last July, and it's been growing fairly quickly. I felt like it was a good time to announce my involvement last week, and we have some seed investment from Barry Silbert with the Digital Currency Group and Roger Ver, both of whom have done amazing things for the industry, and I feel honored to call them among my friends.
And so you are providing an exchange for a lot of altcoins. Now, I'm a skeptic. Can you give me something to make me start paying attention to at least some of these altcoins?
Yeah. So yeah, when you say you're a skeptic, you mean that you're skeptical of the value of any of these altcoins. So
yes.
I had been I had been vehemently opposed to altcoins for quite a while. The main reason was that I felt like Bitcoin was such a momentous project and so important, and there was so much work to do, that anyone who's spending time or resources on these sort of side projects was kind of taking away from the main Bitcoin project that was so important. I changed my view on that to some degree because I saw that all these side coins that were being built, there was a lot of really important technical experimentation that was going on. And I think most of these altcoins are silly and stupid. Most of them will not exist long term. But they are all sort of permitting this cauldron of innovation where people can test out new ideas and new concepts and create new assets. And some of these assets aren't really, they're more like complementary goods to Bitcoin, not competitive goods. So for example, you have these currencies that are pegged to dollars, like BitUSD and Nubits and Tether. And these are all very cool because they maintain the value that a dollar is. So they're far more stable than Bitcoin, and yet they move around with the ease and frictionlessness of Bitcoin. And so a lot of people like how Bitcoin works and how it operates, and so they don't just want a digital version of fiat. But for those who really care about stability, they can have that. So they're complementary goods, and I think the ecosystem is healthier to the extent that this experimentation goes on. And as I came to that understanding, I realized that I saw that these altcoins weren't going away. Like, many would go away, but the industry itself remained and kept growing. And so I realized that there's no reason that it shouldn't be instant for one asset to convert into another. Each of these popular digital assets should be completely liquid and immediately liquid into anything else. And so that was sort of the impetus for Shapeshift.
What is the difference? You mentioned the altcoins, which are pegged to dollar. What is the difference between them, or how are they maybe superior, if they are, compared to just colored coins, which might, end up doing the same purpose but directly on Bitcoin blockchain?
Yeah, and frankly, I don't really care which it is. I mean, hopefully people build in both ways, and the market will kind of figure out what's more secure and what works better. Each of those three that I mentioned, Tether, BitUSD, and Nubits, they all have a sort of different mechanism for pegging to the dollar. And maybe all three will work, maybe none of them will work, but the point is that people are experimenting and trying things. Certainly, a lot of that could be done with colored coins as well. So if you think that's superior, go get it built, and we'll stick it up on Shapeshift if it gets popular.
Okay, let's start picking up some questions. 1 second. So a question from Jesse. It seems like banks are trying to make all digital currency attempts through cell phones and so on. Now we have Facebook Pay offering new transfer of fiat. Do you think it's possible for banks to emulate Bitcoin function enough to delay the inevitable crash, or even compete against Bitcoin? What do you think about all these attempts?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess another example is like Apple Pay and what Facebook is doing. It's important to understand that those are marginal improvements to the ability to send dollars to people. They are not entirely new financial foundations. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is an entirely new foundation on which people can build financial assets. So yeah, in the short term, I would expect huge brands like Facebook and Apple Pay to have way more users of those payment systems than Bitcoin. But the problem is they're building a nice shiny product on top of a decrepit old financial, ruinous swamp, where the core technology underlying the PayPal payment system is the US dollar, this fiat currency that really should not have any value and only has value by decree of the king. So if they want to build services that improve on this sort of terrible old financial system, go for it. Make that system a little less terrible. But Bitcoin has replaced things from the ground up. And so while it is rougher around the edges, while it doesn't have these billion-dollar companies building products on it yet, the foundation of it, the distributed ledger, the blockchain, is far superior as a way of tracking and managing a economy's money than is fiat and banks and fractional reserve. So long term, I have no doubt which one will win. But in the short term, it doesn't really bother me that these big companies are making payment systems. I think they're not really competitors so much as these companies are building kind of the best of a dying world, and Bitcoin is the new.
Yeah, I agree. It's very similar in my opinion with credit cards. They're doing, and they have been doing a great job in providing the seamless service in the framework that we have. Unfortunately, the framework itself is broken, but the thing is the very design of the credit card as we know it, with the private key essentially printed on the credit card, and you have to give it away every time you make a transaction, just makes it so obsolete and impossible to maintain in the future. That now no matter how much they try, they simply are just delaying the inevitable, and the inherent costs in the anti-fraud, in the insurance, and everything which is caused just by the basic fundamental design make it most probably impossible for them to compete in the long run with this new concept that cryptocurrencies create.
Yeah, and let me add one more thing. You will never be able to send $50,000 of your Facebook credits to your friend in Africa, right? It is stuck to the old financial rails, and it has to comply with all of these rules of the banking system. So it can only be a marginal improvement on the banking system. It can't offer the groundbreaking revolution that is Bitcoin, where you can send $10 million to a stranger over the internet, and the stranger can immediately have it and know that it is money good when he receives it, and there's no censorship of the transaction. It is just this pure monetary freedom, and Apple Pay and Facebook credits can never match that.
I agree, and the moment that you would try to unleash, or they, meaning the regulators, would try to unleash the legacy industry and allow them first remove their privileges and at the same time allow them to remove and to scrap all the regulatory hindrance that they are now facing with KYC, AML, and so on. They would most probably turn on to cryptocurrencies eventually anyway, because the idea is so revolutionary that the competition would make it inevitable for them to go that direction.
Yep.
Let's put on air another question from Derek. Is it a better strategy to push for existing industries to transition to Bitcoin, or to create new players, however small, in those industries as proof of concept or competition? Derek is in robots and automation, and he can see a great potential for machines handling their own money, but he's not sure which of those strategies would lead to that world faster or more certainly.
I think that's one of those sort of how do we promote and grow Bitcoin in the best way, and there isn't really one good answer. And this is the beauty of a decentralized system. Different people can try out different strategies in different industries. So if you are close to a certain industry and you know certain people in that industry, you're going to be the best one to figure out how to bring Bitcoin into that world. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to sort of figure out this like top-down marketing strategy for how Bitcoin connects with the world, because it's going to be different in different regions and with different demographics and different industries.
Okay, before we start getting any more questions, let's get back to Shapeshift a little bit. I was thinking, seeing all those exchanges and all those transactions and the altcoins happening at your platform, are there any particular altcoins that can you see the trend? Can you see which altcoins are being hyped and then just disappear? Can you see long-term stability in some of them based on what's happening on your platform?
Yeah. Yes, there's certainly some interesting data that we've seen. The volume in terms of dollars for each of these coins moving through Shapeshift tends to follow generally the market cap size and the trading volume of those coins. So, a coin like Litecoin is going to have a lot more volume than something that's kind of ranked number 20th on CoinMarketCap. But it's not a perfect representation, and there are some other examples. So, like Darkcoin, for example, has a really clear use case, right? It's for people who want even more privacy than what Bitcoin offers by default. And so Darkcoin has a relatively high portion of transactions on Shapeshift, more so than some of the coins that are larger than it. Like there's a much higher volume of Bitcoin to Darkcoin than Bitcoin to Ripple, even though Ripple, if you measure by market cap or dollar exchange value, is a larger market. So I think that speaks to the fact that there's actually use cases for Darkcoin, whereas Ripple maybe not as much yet. Another thing we see is that during periods where the Bitcoin price is falling over time, we see a general outflow of value from the altcoins into Bitcoin, and the reverse is also true. So during periods where the Bitcoin price is rising, people generally are leaving Bitcoin into the altcoins. And that sounds confusing at first, but it makes total sense when you realize that altcoins are sort of more speculative plays on the cryptocurrency industry. They are more volatile and more risky than Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin's falling, you would expect altcoins to fall more, and when Bitcoin's rising, you would expect altcoins to rise more. They're just a more volatile asset class. So I think I would have understood that sort of theoretically before, but we actually see that trend in Shapeshift, which is interesting.
And so you touched Darkon, and I think a lot of people here are interested in that, but maybe not all of them actually know it. What exactly is Darkon, and how do they achieve that higher level of privacy?
I wish I could answer that. I'm really not an expert on any or many of the coins that are on Shapeshift other than Bitcoin. So when we add a coin, it's not because I've gone and investigated it and think it's going to be a great performer. We basically just kind of sit back and watch what the market does. And those coins that the market starts to get excited about, we consider adding to the platform. So I would not be the right person to tell you why Darkcoin is more anonymous than Bitcoin. That would need to be someone else, but I'm sure their website would go a ways in doing that.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing, we spoke about that off air before. Your profile says you're based in Panama City. That's actually just partially the case. You're all around the place. Which places, which jurisdictions do you see are the right ones to run the Bitcoin business? Which would you recommend? Is there anything, or which would you say are definitely not the place to be for running Bitcoin startup?
Well, one thing that I came to learn is that the physical location of the business or of the people involved is not as important as where the business's customers are. So regulation will generally be applied to you based on where your customers are. So an example of this is in the online gambling world. There are a lot of online gambling casino companies that are in the U.S. Their operations are in the U.S. They're based there, but they don't serve the U.S. market. They don't allow U.S. customers, and they don't get hassled. But if you were in some other country and you allowed U.S. customers, then the U.S. government might get upset about that, because then you're allowing the free citizens of the United States to make choices with their own money, and that's not permitted. So it generally matters much more where your customers are than where you are, or where you're actually incorporated.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, do we have any more? Wait, my chat is paused up. Any more questions? Questions from the audience? If not, Erik, is there anything else that you would want to talk about?
I don't think so. I think in general, one thing I've noticed is that people have gotten a little wiser with their money when it comes to Bitcoin, and the industry is certainly maturing. Like when I got involved, 3 or 4 years ago, it was very clear that it was an amateur industry, and every website that was out there was created by just kind of hobbyists in their basements. And now we are here a few years later, and we see these big companies raising tens of millions, or this company 21 a couple weeks ago that raised $100 million or $117 million as their first round. These are really good signs that the industry is professionalizing, and that incredible talent and teams in productive capacity are being invested into this. And that is all much more important than watching the price charts, because the price charts are more prone to sort of emotional speculation and temporary technical analysis and all these things that aren't fundamental. The fundamental strength of Bitcoin is getting better and better and better. And as these companies that are raising tens of millions of dollars bring these products to market, I think we can expect quite a bit of really amazing things to come out of this industry. So I always say this when I do interviews, but it's always more and more exciting to be involved in this.
Yeah. Do you have any favorites amongst those that either have been announced recently or that are going through some change? Is there anything in the industry, startup, or maybe just some general trend in some concept that you are really excited about?
Right now, and for the last couple months, I've been really excited about the remittance companies,
Okay.
like BitPesa and Coins.ph and SendBitcoin.mx and a couple others. These are executions and manifestations of what we all imagined would happen, which is that we all realized that Bitcoin would be awesome for remittances and international money flows. But it was sort of just in the idea stage, and everyone was just kind of excited that it would happen one day. But now, actually, in the last 6 months, it's actually happening, and these companies are real, and they have real remittance corridors that they're focusing on, where real people that don't care at all about the ideology of Bitcoin or how it works or anything about the blockchain, they just finally can send money more easily. And so this is an amazing demonstration of the use cases of this technology that had been sort of fundamentally understood but not yet very executed. So that's the sector that I'm most excited about this year. I think this 2015 is going to be the year where Bitcoin remittances becomes a substantial player. That's what people should be watching, I think, for a while.
Yeah, I agree, and there's a lot of skepticism towards that I'm hearing. Yesterday, actually, I had a discussion with one investor about this, and the argument I keep hearing is, yeah, but both parties of this transaction in the remittances actually don't they don't see Bitcoin at all. They have no idea they're dealing with Bitcoin, which, I mean, you might consider negative, but still, that transaction provides utility for Bitcoin. It provides the liquidity. It makes sure that there are two parties, or at least one party, which keeps Bitcoin on the stock to have it ready for something like that to happen. So even this doesn't necessarily give too much exposure to Bitcoin per se. At least it gives it the utility and the liquidity, which is very important. Question by Travis: do you see any Netscape app for Bitcoin that is outcoming soon to bring it to the masses?
I mean, Netscape alone changed the world completely. So do I see one app or one company that is going to change the world as much as Netscape? No, not yet. But of course, when Netscape came out, I think a lot of people didn't see it as the revolution it would become either. So sometimes you can only answer that in hindsight. But probably the best sort of user interface and experience that I've seen is what Circle has done with their customer e-wallet. They just have made it really beautiful and sleek, and I think that will, right now, that's the exception, and as that becomes the norm, Bitcoin will become appealing to normal consumers and not just the techies and ideologues who have been its cheerleaders so far.
No. Another question from Mojdetko, and I would love to know who that is because it's a Slovak name. Someone is trolling me here, and I have no idea who that is. Sorry, it's an internal joke in a way. Do you use multi-sig enabled wallets regularly? What is your experience? And maybe talk in general, what is multi-signature wallets for those who don't know?
Yeah, so a normal wallet is where essentially the wallet has a private key, and as soon as it signs a transaction, the money can be released. And of course, that means that there's only one key that needs to be compromised in one location. Multi-sig is simple conceptually. It just means that there are several private keys that need to sign a transaction for it to be released. So those keys can be in different places and controlled by different people or different criteria. and this vastly improves the security of a Bitcoin wallet. So thankfully, the industry is very quickly moving to where multi-sig is not a luxury or a weird interest, but is sort of the standard. And I see people in the community, whenever they hear about wallets that are not using multi-sig, they kind of rightly call it out and say, that is antiquated. That's an antiquated model. Why aren't you using multi-sig? So this is just an example of the industry, getting smarter and wiser and healthier. So I definitely recommend that everyone in Bitcoin understand what multi-sig is. And there are very easy multi-sig wallets to use. BitGo is one of the leaders right now. Green Address is another really good one. So yeah, at least try it out, see how it works, see how you set up the different signatures. It's not as complicated as it sounds, and it provides vastly more security. If you're only storing small amounts of Bitcoin, you don't need to worry about that stuff, but you should at least be familiar with it. And anyone storing anything significant absolutely has to be very familiar with how that works.
Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes for those who will be watching later. I put the link to BitGo, at least to the chat. Thanks for that question. Another question from Jesse. Can you speak what is going on with Bitcoin Foundation? Do you have any position on it? Is it any relevant to Bitcoin growth?
Yeah, so the Bitcoin Foundation has had an amazing ability at attracting controversy. Some may be deserved, and some just kind of blown out of proportion by the pitchfork mobs. But in general, I think there's a very healthy distrust of anything that represents centralization in the Bitcoin industry. And this is healthy, even though a lot of the criticisms might be overblown. So the Bitcoin Foundation, just by its name and how it kind of got started early, sort of as a central body that would help guide the industry or encourage it in certain directions or be an advocate for it. Anyone that steps into that position and tries to sort of be a governing is not the right word, but a central body of information or influence is going to be attacked by the industry, and that's fine. That's good. I think they've done a lot of good work. I mean, the conferences that they'd put on, the San Jose conference and the Amsterdam conference, were two of the most important events in the industry. They bring thousands of people together to get projects, figured out, and all the networking that goes on. And that alone is a tremendous benefit of the foundation. But they also do a lot of things that people don't see, and they are called on by politicians and regulators and banks to help explain what Bitcoin is. And as much as you may have a distrust of the Bitcoin Foundation, it is filled with people who are generally passionate about this project. And obviously there are disagreements on the best strategies, but I think people should realize that the Bitcoin Foundation is certainly not an evil organization. It may have problems, and it is right to be skeptical of anything so central, but in general, I think they've been a net positive, and I think they're working really hard to kind of clean up their image. And ultimately, it is a membership-driven organization, and they do not have power over Bitcoin. So if you don't like them, you don't really have to interact with them at all. But to the extent that they can encourage people to donate and sort of bring power and influence together under one roof, they can do some good things. And as long as they don't have like actual control, like capital C control over the Bitcoin project, then I don't see any harm in it.
Yeah, I think Jesse here agrees. Okay, another question from Creep2Who. Would you see Bitcoin suited to be used for micro payments further down the road as Bitcoin networks grow more expensive? I would add there's this service called ChangeTip, which goes around the Bitcoin network fees, and I'm pretty sure we'll see more. But yeah, I'll let you, Erik, to talk about that.
Yeah, so I didn't quite hear the question. It's about microtransactions.
If Bitcoin will be suited for to be used as micro payments as Bitcoin network grows more expensive. But there is the assumption that Bitcoin network grows more expensive, which I don't think is necessarily the correct one, but I'll let you go on.
Yeah. Yeah, Bitcoin's absolutely amazing for microtransactions, and even transactions that happen over the blockchain it works pretty well for. But in the future, I think it's going to be sort of a progressive change, but most transactions that are in the Bitcoin world are not going to happen on the blockchain. It is more efficient to do them internally at various parties, and to use the blockchain more as like a clearing mechanism between these parties. But when you say that, people get really nervous, and they're like, "Well, then isn't that just re-centralizing the system?" And again, that skepticism of anything central is healthy, but it's important to understand that whereas the banking system and the fiat system is centralized fundamentally at the most basic level, Bitcoin will always be decentralized fundamentally at the most basic level. The blockchain will always exist, and you will always have the right and the ability to send a transaction over that blockchain network without people being able to censor it or stop it. To the extent that there is a cost to those transactions, a lot of firms will just internalize transactions within their networks. And this is good. This should not be something to fear. This is just more efficiency coming into the system where efficiency makes sense. And as long as you can always opt out of any company, as long as you don't have to use any central company, and you can always sort of retreat back into the neutral, decentralized ground of the blockchain, I don't think there's any need to worry about that. So yeah, microtransactions can totally be accommodated in that model, and I think ChangeTip is a really good example of that. Coinbase will send a lot of transactions internally, so you can tip tiny amounts to people like that, and that's all great. But you can always go back to the blockchain if you want to.
Yeah, I agree. It reminds me a little bit of Ronald Coase and his thesis why we have companies. Well, because we have transaction costs, and to a certain extent, centralization removes those transaction costs. At some point, there might be more disadvantages than advantages, but yeah, we'll see the industry establishing itself. And yeah, as you mentioned, ChangeTip, but also Coinbase are doing a lot of off-chain transactions without people maybe even realizing it. So the transaction costs for those are literally zero, and remain so. By the way, also we actually had transaction fees being slashed tenfold already a few months ago, and we can expect that to continue, though in a more, let's say, supply and demand way, as integrated in the protocol in one of its latest versions. So I wouldn't be too worried. Okay, last question. What does Erik think of Winklevoss twins? And let me pull out the quote from your article on the bit license. Bitcoin visionaries Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss responded to the announcement with the following: "We are pleased that Superintendent Losky and the Department of Financial Services have embraced Bitcoin and digital assets and created a regulatory framework that protects consumers." And then your comment: "Cameron and Tyler, this is shameful. Losky has embraced Bitcoin? Really? Dozens of diktats which manage state surveillance and censorship is the very antithesis of Bitcoin." Can you add anything to that?
Yeah, I won't comment on the Winklevi personally, but I'll comment on that sentiment that they express, which is not unique to them. A lot of people in the industry and even a lot of business leaders feel like they have to use that kind of language where you sort of bow down to the king and give him all the respect and honor that he feels he deserves. And why respect and honor is given to people who try to harm other peaceful individuals who haven't hurt anyone, I don't know. I think it's kind of a social sickness, but that's how a lot of people act. I hope that as this industry grows, that people will, at least at the margins, resist this kind of coddling of politicians and the respect given to people who don't deserve it. I understand the point of being diplomatic, and I don't think it's wise for Bitcoiners to make enemies with regulators. But at the same time, the concept of respect is an important one, and honor, and I think that's something that is needed in the business world and in Bitcoin certainly. So yeah, it's a tricky balance. In general, I'm glad that there are people in Bitcoin working in all different strategies. From the very political who work completely within the system and who lavish praise upon the various regulations, all the way down to like the most anarchistic anarchists who are completely hostile, and everything in between. I think it's the Hydra strategy that wins the day, and so ultimately I'm glad that people kind of work in all those directions.
Okay, we'll end on that. Thank you very much, Erik. Everyone, check out shapeshift.io if you want to get your hands on some first altcoins. It's probably the best place right now to get them through Bitcoin or through maybe some other altcoins that you already hold. Thanks, Erik. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Bye. You're probably not very much surprised about banking or banks not being particularly friendly to Bitcoin.
Yeah, every industry that sees a disruptor coming is not going to be super friendly to that industry. The publishing industry went through this with the internet. Banks, of course, have generally felt completely insulated from competition for hundreds of years. And finally now there is a technology that actually challenges them. I don't think they quite realize it. I don't think they realize the extent of the danger to them. They don't realize that this is actually an existential threat to their business model. They're paying attention to Bitcoin a little bit, but they don't really, they still kind of laugh at it, I think. And when they realize that it's gotten big enough, there's going to come a moment where they become extremely hostile. So far they're not that hostile. It's more like they don't want to open accounts for Bitcoin companies. That's mostly a regulatory issue because they feel like there's too much risk.
Hey everybody, welcome. Hi Erik, nice seeing you. So
Hello.
I'd like to start with the quote on your homepage, moneyandstate.com, which I highly recommend, by the way. Give me control of nation's money, and I don't care who makes its laws. Talk about that, and talk about how does that relate to Bitcoin, or how Bitcoin relates to that.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just jump right into that one. Yeah, the quote is, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." And this was said by one of the Rothschilds, who are the famous banking family, and basically the idea is that the laws of a country are not nearly as important as control or influence of the flow of money or capital. And this was obviously a very telling thing for someone in the banking industry to say, and it certainly is very true. I think in general, the banks can do whatever they wish so long as they maintain control over the realm of money, and the rest of the law doesn't really matter to them because money is so crucial to everything. So it's a great quote when it comes to Bitcoin because the inverse is kind of true as well. If no one has control of the money, then no one need care about the laws as much either. So it's sort of a motto that I like to live by, and essentially, if you are an individual and now you control your own money through Bitcoin, you become sort of the law unto yourself. And I think this is a very important concept when it comes to how Bitcoin works and how it empowers people.
So if we're talking about the current framework we have, we're not in Bitcoin yet. When you're saying that this is very telling that someone from banking said it, how does it work that both banking and the state profit from this scheme? Why are there their why are they aligned in
of the deposit to other people. So if there's $10,000 in deposit, they can loan that out to someone else, and now they make money on the money that they can loan out, but they also create money. This is where the fractional reserve comes from. They create money by loaning out more than they actually have. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Of course, in a free banking economy, that still could happen. The problem is that it's risky, and the risk is borne by the taxpayer when it's a government-based money system. Because if banks lend out and they extend themselves too far, and that risk collapses in on itself, all the banks in the U.S., of course, are FDIC insured, which means it's just a fancy word for the taxpayers will come and bail you out if the bank fails. So banks, which are private companies, get this amazing benefit, this amazing privilege, this license, sort of literally to print money through both the fiat system and the fractional reserve model that they operate upon.
So having said that, in maintaining the system that we have right now.
Yeah. Well, the system would probably be called the fiat money system and the fractional reserve banking system. And these two concepts are important to understand individually, but together they give the banking industry and the government massive power. Basically, the fiat means money that has value by decree. Essentially, that's what we use: U.S. dollars or euros or yen. That's all fiat money. And fiat is important because if you're the group that gets to create and control money, you can create it out of thin air and spend it. Everyone understands why counterfeiting is illegal, and yet we have one institution that is given a license to counterfeit whenever they wish. And why that's permissible, I'm not sure, but somehow people got tricked into allowing one group to do that. So that's fiat, and then the fractional reserve system is how banks have operated for a long time. Essentially, when they get deposits, they can loan out a multiple